Good morning, Dan and Amy. And the Hurricane Telethon the other night featured some great artists. Your Beyonce's.
George Strait ended it out
Your George
with a live
Straits.
performance from San Antonio.
Your Stevie Wonder. Apparently he can sing. I thought he was just a climatologist, and you can understand my confusion.
We've come together today to love on the people that have been devastated by the hurricanes. When love goes into action, it preferences no color of skin, no ethnicity, no religious beliefs, no sexual preferences, and no political persuasions. It just loves. As we should begin to love and value our planet, and anyone who believes that there is no such thing as global warming must be blind or unintelligent. Lord, please save us all.
All right.
Now touch the TV and I will be healed.
All right. So now that we got the climatology part of this segment done, pleased to introduce Patrick Moore, co-founder of Greenpeace, who's here to sing Signed, Sealed, and Delivered. You got to do the Stevie Wonder part, Patrick.
Hi, Dan. Well, I was surprised that he said they're either blind or unintelligent, because he at least fits one of those categories.
Indeed.
Oh, wow.
Indeed.
That was
Hello.
That was a strange twist. Hi, Amy. It's just unfortunate that these celebrities play on this fear of climate change and global warming, and actually, no one questions that the Earth has warmed slightly in the last 200 or 300 years, coming out of the Little Ice Age, which was not a very pleasant time for people trying to grow food in northern climates. We're lucky that we are living in the modern warm period, and there's been ups and downs all through history, of course, and there was over a mile of ice on top of Chicago 10,000 to 20,000 years ago. And that's climate change coming out of the last glaciation, which was one of approximately 40 glaciation periods that have occurred during the last 2.5 million years. And those were definitely not a good time to be in Canada or Russia or Scandinavia or even the northern United States, because those glaciers came right down into the northern tier states, including Illinois.
Well, I just think that
people don't study enough to understand what's really going on with the world, and the fact that we're actually living in a relatively benign climate today compared to what it's been like through much of the last 2 million years.
But who else are they going to blame besides the climate change? I mean, they can't process the fact that we had Hurricane Harvey and then Hurricane Irma a few days later.
Yes, it's the weather. And it's been happening since the beginning of time. Hurricanes are not a new phenomenon.
Especially in September.
We do only have about 100 years' worth of really good records for them, because, when Galveston in 1915, when 6,000 people died in the hurricane there, it was largely because there was absolutely no warning in those days. They didn't know those things were coming. And all of a sudden they're in a 140-mile-an-hour wind and a 15-foot surge of the sea, and that killed 6,000 people. But today, we can evacuate days ahead of time. We have much better structures now than they did then in terms of the building codes and all of that. And that's why the loss of life is so much less now than it was back then from these very powerful storms, which are just part of nature.
Well, and it's interesting, too, because it's not just you saying it as a scientist, co-founder of Greenpeace. These governmental agencies that the left is otherwise inclined to believe as a matter of faith, regardless of their pronouncements or the evidentiary basis for them, NASA, NOAA, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change at the UN, they all have said in the wake of Harvey and Irma, there is not sufficient evidence to confirm a link between climate change and the hurricanes. There is no necessary trend in frequency or intensity over more than 100 years, but I didn't hear that reference at the telethon.
No, and it's unfortunate because, NASA, NOAA, and the IPCC are not monolithic. They have different factions within themselves. But on all three of those organizations make it very clear that the link between global warming or climate change and extreme weather events does not exist. There's actually been a slight decline in hurricane intensity since the 1990s when there was a peak. But if you go back 100 years, you can see that there is essentially no trend. And so that means that you cannot link the slight warming that has occurred with any trend in hurricane activity or droughts or heavy rainfall. I mean, they make it out as if Harvey was the biggest rainfall in the history of the world. It's not true. It did break a record for the amount of rain that fell over a 3 or 4 day period, but it did not break a record for the amount of rain that fell in a 24-hour period. So that you can parse and slice these records down to minutia. There's a record broken every day in many parts of the world of one sort or another, depending on how you define it. But the fact is, there is no significant trend in anything much besides a bit of warming. And that's a good thing because the farmers get a longer growing season. We have less freezing and more thawing. And frost is basically the enemy of plants and life in general. If you go from the tropics, where biodiversity is by far the highest of anywhere on Earth, in the tropical rainforests, etc., you go to the North Pole and tell me how many species you count. And that's just the way it is. And the fact is, before this ice age came on 2-3 million years ago, there were trees and forests growing on all of Canada's Arctic islands, which are basically barren tundra today, with a few species that have managed to evolve to live in those conditions miraculously. Just shows you how able life is to adapt to harsh conditions. But they are harsh conditions compared to, say, the conditions in California, land of milk and honey. I mean, the Mediterranean climate is probably the best mix of all, and also the high altitude climates in the tropics, where you have eternal spring, like in Oaxaca and in Cuernavaca and the capitals of the South American cities that straddle the border, that are up high, where it's pleasant all year round. But the rest of the world is not like that. There's hurricanes, and there's blizzards, and there's droughts, and there's floods, and all of that. They're going to keep occurring regardless of the climate change. And in fact, we really don't know whether human beings have anything to do with the warming itself, because it started long before we started using a lot of fossil fuels.
Yeah,
like
but we always keep hearing
ago.
like the depletion of the ozone. Is that just a bunch of racket too?
Yeah, pretty much. The main thing we should be addressing is actual pollution, actual toxic materials going into the air and the water and the earth. And we're doing a pretty good job of that in the wealthy countries. China still has a lot of work to do, and Indonesia, and these countries that have industrialized but still haven't put the money into making it clean. And so you have CNN putting pictures of dirty air in China and talking about climate change and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is invisible, and it is not a pollutant. And hopefully the administration in the United States, which is taking the leadership on trying to get a more scientific approach to this subject, will reverse the endangerment finding on carbon dioxide, because CO2 is the basis of all life on Earth, and we're teaching our children that it's a poison. And it's definitely one of the worst things that's ever happened in science, this climate hysteria that is gripping the whole world.
Well, Pat, yeah, we've talked about this with respect to the PC-addled, empty-headed celebrities like Stevie Wonder and Beyonce. They're very talented, but they don't know what they're talking about. Okay, fine. Pope Francis and others who suggest, hey, essentially talk to the scientists. The debate is over. People that aren't necessarily looking for political power, like, for example, the pontiff. What do you think the basis of his pronouncements, which are of a kind with those politicians who are seeking power, or those celebrities who are just trying to follow the zeitgeist of the culture? How do you respond to Pope Francis, for example?
Well, he's definitely really far on the left. And they have a science academy in the Vatican, and he only listens to the people who are telling him that he should focus on this climate change subject, because he tries to appeal to the poor and the downtrodden. He's in that category in the Catholic Church that actually he doesn't like capitalism, he doesn't like industry, and he says that the earth has turned into a pile of filth in his climate change encyclical. So I really do believe that he is actually looking for power. He's looking to his base in the Catholic Church, which are actually, I don't think the Catholic Church is doing them any favor.
Yeah.
I think they want a donation from them. I mean, the Vatican is one of the wealthiest little parts of geography in the world, and it's all because people give money in order to make sure that they go to heaven. And, you know, the whole original sin thing, climate change plays into it perfectly, that God is angry with us because we are sinning by putting carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and changing the climate, and we should feel guilty about that, and the only way to get rid of our guilt is to give money to the church. So it's an old story. I have to admit I'm pretty much of an agnostic when it comes to organized religion.
Well, that's okay. We don't have to have a theological discussion. Just we don't want to have a climatological one with Stevie Wonder. Pat, we appreciate, though, the science discussion and your expertise in this area, since the left is always admonishing people that are just looking at the data. We'll talk to the scientists. Well, that's what we do. That's why we have Patrick Moore on the show. Patrick Moore, the co-founder of Greenpeace. Patrick, thanks as always for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.